program started. Good evening, everyone. My name is Olivia Zink, Executive Director of Open Democracy, a nonpartisan nonprofit organization. And I want to thank you so much for being with us tonight, really so that we can change the way elections are funded here in New Hampshire. We come together today as mothers, daughters, as fathers, as grandparents. We come as community leaders. I see some elected officials in the House. I see some senators here. I see activists. I see people who care about our community. That we really do have the power to change the systems. We see injustice and corruption, and we have the power to change those. And we're going to start by changing the way we fund elections. I hope tonight's program will inspire you. Today, we come together to grow our relationships, to build power, to organize for campaign finance reform. You will hear today from Sam Waterston and Larry Lessig about their journeys and why they're committed to the solutions to get rid of big money in our political system, and why small donor citizen-funded elections matters, so that voters' voices matter more than donors' voices. How many of you are fed up with TV ads? Yeah? How many of you are filled up with your political mailboxes being full of flyers? And are you fed up about people buying political influence? We have seen the growing influence of outside money, dark money, and independent expenditures. And we watch this problem getting worse, but it's going to stop, and we're going to stop it. We are the enforceable power to stop it. Together we will work to change the system. Together we will build a more inclusive, robust democracy. Together we will change the way elections are funded so that voters' voices will be heard again. It's going to take all of us. We're going to be working across any lines that divide us. And we're going to be loud, right? We're going to be loud. We are a diverse choir of voices demanding reform. I want to welcome everyone. Thank you for joining our community of reformers. And I'd like to introduce Dan Weeks, who will introduce our most distinguished guest.
Can we give one more round of applause to Olivia and the team? Thank you so much. Well, it's an honor to be with you. Good evening, everyone. My name is Dan Weeks. I serve as chair of the advisory board of Open Democracy. And a few years ago, I had the honor of being the executive director. I also had the honor of introducing our special guests tonight. So it was about 2.5 years ago. It was a blizzard, as I recall, in the middle of January of 2016, when our first honored guest got in a car and drove himself, well, it should have been, I think, 4 hours. It was probably 6 or 7, as I recall, through that blizzard to New Hampshire in the middle of January to walk and talk with the New Hampshire Rebellion on the eve of the 2016 presidential primary, proving, I would submit, that he is indeed the real McCoy. Sam Waterston, as you well know, is an American actor, a producer, a director, an activist, among many, many roles. He's noted for his portrayal of Sidney Schonberg in The Killing Fields back in 1984, which he received an Academy Award nomination. He's also starred as, of course, the real McCoy, Jack McCoy, in that long-running NBC series, which is back, Law and Order. And as a result of his portrayals in that film, his long run there, he received Golden Globe and Screen Actors Guild Awards. He's been nominated for multiple Golden Globes, as well as BAFTA and Emmy Awards, having starred in over 80 film and television productions during his 50-year career and counting. Sam has also starred in numerous stage productions, and all-movie historian Hal Erickson characterizes him as having, I like this description, cultivated a loyal following with his quietly charismatic, unfailingly solid performances. I think we would all agree. I have a little confession. He's telling me to get on with it. My confession is that I actually grew up under a rock here in New Hampshire. I didn't even know Law and Order existed until I left home. But when I quizzed my wife about our special guest, she assured me that back in the 90s, Law and Order reached all the way to Johannesburg, South Africa. It was a show that she was raised on in Johannesburg, and so certainly his influence has reached far and wide. Would you join me then in welcoming our first honored guest to the stage, Sam Waterston.
This is where you want me to sit?
Perfect. It wasn't a blizzard this morning, but it was a hurricane when you left Connecticut. Now, if Sam proved his chops walking with the New Hampshire Rebellion on that blizzardy winter in January 2016, no offense, Mr. Waterston, but our second guest, Professor Lawrence Lessig, was the one who instigated, inspired, and led not just that one walk that weekend in January 2016, but a whole series of walks in which many of you tonight also participated. Some 40,000, are we up to 50,000 miles collectively as part of the New Hampshire Rebellion, from the very top of New Hampshire and Dixville Notch all the way to Nashua, not once but twice, and then many more walks besides. I think many of you know him, but for those who don't, Professor Lessig is the Roy Furman Professor of Law and Leadership at Harvard Law School. Prior to joining Harvard, he was a professor at Stanford Law, where he founded the school's Center for Internet and Society, and was also at the University of Chicago. He clerked for Judge Richard Posner on the Seventh Circuit, as well as the late Justice Antonin Scalia on the U.S. Supreme Court. Larry serves on many boards and has supported many causes, including the AXA Research Fund, on the advisory board of Creative Commons and the Sunlight Foundation. He's a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, the American Philosophical Association, has received far too many awards to count tonight, including the Free Software Foundation's Freedom Award, Fast Case 50 Award, being named one of Scientific America's top 50 visionaries. And Larry, of course, besides his distinguished academic career, has been an activist in every sense of the word, from instigating the New Hampshire Rebellion and founding other reform causes, and leading those walks, as I noted before, to in fact throwing his hat in the ring for President of the United States on precisely this issue. So would you join me in welcoming to the stage Professor Lawrence Lessig? The man who drove the furthest, starting in the hurricane, Sam Waterston, to share with us why you agreed to jump back in the car and come back to New Hampshire. And then after Sam's remarks, Larry's going to take it away and lead us in a conversation, the two of them, and also with the audience. So thanks and welcome, Sam.
Thank you. There's a real question in the air as to why, given the two people on this platform, he isn't doing all the talking. But be that as it may, here we are, and here I go. I don't live or vote in New Hampshire, and it's a pretty long drive for me to get here, especially when I'm chasing or being chased by a hurricane. So it's a legitimate question to ask, Sam, what are you doing here? The answer is I came because I wanted to say to you, and to anyone who may be paying attention to what you're doing and what I'm saying, that you're in the right place at the right time doing the right thing. I want to thank Daniel Weeks, Olivia Zink, and Professor Lessig for persevering through my difficulties with scheduling anything at all, and answering any emails in a timely fashion, and dealing with traffic on Route 93, and all the various things that were needed to help get me here, and for being here themselves. That the funding of our elections is out of whack is as plain as the nose on your face. Anyone running for office at almost any level of government knows they will face a mighty headwind of money. Money they must raise to put themselves forward, money being raised by their opponents that they must counter to prevent their case from being overwhelmed by distortions and distractions. There are notable exceptions, candidates who've managed to get through the noise without very much money, and this fact should give us some optimism about the resilience of the brand of democracy we have in this beautiful country. Nowhere more beautiful than here in New Hampshire, but it's a long way from showing that everything's okay. From our country's beginnings, people who thought about these things, especially the founding fathers themselves, knew that differences of means would be fertile ground for factions to grow in. And they saw factions as the greatest threat to democratic government. But the difference in wealth between the richest and poorest Americans then was much narrower than it is now, and the threat of faction was that much weaker. Money's power has never been greater than it is today, with the possible exception of that period before the Great Depression when there was a commonplace joke about having the best government money could buy. When I was living in New York City, there used to be a commercial that ran all the time whose slogan was, "Money talks, nobody walks." Money talks, indeed it does. It persuades, it bribes, it buys. Money is a mighty power. Long before money is spent directly in a race between two candidates, money alters the nature of our conversations with ourselves. Sometimes the influence can be almost incredibly cheap. It didn't cost the Russians much of anything at all to distort the internet conversation in the last election, for instance. As we learn more about the web's uses and abuses, we may find a way to better protect our conversation with ourselves from such intrusions and from the dishonest distractions and disruptions of bad actors on Facebook and Twitter. But money, all the while and ever after, will be having its say. So when I say, and you say, that the elections themselves should be protected from the direct influence of money, we know that won't end money's influence. Money will still have its thumb on the scale in every discussion of every issue of public interest. Long before candidate A from party A and candidate B from party B are making their cases to us in a debate on TV, money and the enormous social power that goes with it will have been affecting how we will see and how we will listen to them. And whatever reform the open democracy, fair elections, and every voice movements succeed in making, money will continue to have its say and exercise its sway in all the familiar ways. Money will still have plenty of opportunities and means to make itself heard. So when we seek to restrain money's direct influence in elections themselves, we are only looking to restore the rough balance of interests that existed in the beginning of our country when disparities of wealth were smaller, and that existed again when I was a young man due to a different set of causes that I'll list for you in a minute, but that doesn't exist today. Things are out of whack. The times are out of joint. The rough balance between money interests and the rest of society's interests is just about gone. If you're here, you already know something must be done. I think it's fair to say that if you don't aspire to balance and embrace the perpetual tension between conflicting interests, you are not in favor of the United States Constitution. The founders tried as hard as they could to devise a system that only works when the people operating it embrace balance. They did all they could to allow the many inevitable conflicts that must always arise in a body politic the size of ours to find their way to the surface, to make it to open water, to escape being suppressed, to get out into the light where they could be seen and heard, and the tensions between them managed constructively, not so much resolving them as holding them in creative tension with one another. Despite their best efforts, the founders were not so confident about democracy succeeding in the long term because they knew how much would be required from the citizenry to restrain the very human impulses of people interested in power to form cabals, parties, and factions, and to conspire together to concentrate and hold power by and for themselves, and as it happened before in Greece and Rome, bring an end to democracy. It's so great that you're working to pass election reform in New Hampshire in 2019 because the stakes are just incredibly high. That's why I say you're in the right place at the right time. That's why I'm happy to be with you. I grew up in one of those rare periods of rough balance where the influence of money in politics was temporarily restrained. The causes for that were many. Among them were the shock the Great Depression gave to unbridled capitalism and the fear it struck in capitalism's heart. Franklin Delano Roosevelt's New Deal, World War II itself, because if people were going to fight to defend a way of life, it needed to be clear that that way of life had their interests in mind. If you have a chance, reread the Atlantic Charter that Roosevelt and Churchill signed at the beginning of the war, and you'll see exactly what I mean. The Cold War that followed, which presented the greedy and power-hungry with a stark choice between moderating their hungers and sharing the wealth on the one hand, and the possibility of being overrun by communism on the other. The Civil Rights Movement and the vast injustices of the status quo it revealed, with all that implied about wealth and power. And finally, the wonderful prosperity, growth, and hope for the future that was produced by all those forces working together. Balance and moderating the tensions between interests, along with faith and progress toward more equality among us, turned out to have the very great benefit of making everyone, including the already wealthy, much, much richer. That balance between the interests of the rich and the interests of the rest created a temporary and blessed period of grace that coincided almost exactly with my own life's course. As it turned out, it was a temporary respite in the regular order, under which wealth and power gradually and progressively concentrate at the top. That regular old way of doing things has made a comeback in the last 40 years. I want the good times back. That's why it's so important to me that the essential and central thing in a democracy, the integrity of the vote itself, be protected. That's why I'm so glad to see you here fighting for it. Do not flag. Money has no need to be worried by any of this unless its goal is to dominate and silence the rest of us, because money will always be able to make itself heard. All I want is to keep its hand out of the ballot box. In the bad old days, it was okay to stand outside the polling place and buy votes with cash or a drink. They say that even George Washington did it. The bad old days are back now, trying to use modern means to effect the same result. We know public funding of elections is the best solution to a problem that mightily distorts our politics. In my home state of Connecticut, it's been working well for over a decade, and a generation of politicians has come of age now using it and thriving. People continue to argue about state policies, and mostly they don't approve, and that won't change, and it shouldn't. But now we know the people arguing in Hartford, our representatives, are our representatives. When the people don't think their representatives are their representatives, it makes space for any lying huckster that comes along to claim he is their champion and get away with it. This has to stop. I'm not here because I want to replace money masters with any other set of masters, no matter how rosy a picture of a new order they present. I'm here to support you in your fight for balance, the very thing the founders had in their hearts as they wrote the Constitution. It won't be paradise on earth, but it'll be awfully nice when we get it back, just the same. Thank you. And before we open things up for discussion and for your questions, the organizers of this event asked me to speak a little bit what I've been talking about, how what I've been talking about impacts two important areas that I've been actively interested in for many years: refugees and oceans. There is a relatively new category of refugee now, the climate refugee, that's having a heavy impact on politics in Europe and here and all over the world. There are very large money interests who believe they can make more money by denying or ignoring the human impact on the climate than they could otherwise. So we shouldn't be surprised when a corporation spends money to distort the conversation we have with ourselves about climate change. But we have to fight to protect at least our elections themselves from those distortions. There is no particular curb on speech when we prevent our elections from being bought. The concentration of power in the hands of a few isn't a threat to our freedoms only. It's a threat to our survival. History is full of examples of the rich and powerful making bad decisions. Allowing climate change to worsen and create millions and millions of new refugees in a world already full of them is just another example. As for the oceans, just like the land, are choking on single-use plastic. Mighty and wealthy people and companies across the globe want to make more money by making more and more plastic. But they recognize the public alarm that's growing worldwide as plastics foul our beaches, swamp our trash heaps, and affect fertility rates. But all the while that they know that the best recycling program in the world won't be able to keep up with the increase in plastic production, they urge us to recycle. And they spend money supporting recycling, which is a fine thing, a beautiful thing, a good thing, and we should all do it. But they do it to distract us from the only solution that can really work, which is reducing the amount of single-use plastic being produced.
Sam, thank you for that, which was extraordinary. Although it proves that the first statement you made was wrong, which is that it's you who should have said exactly that. I could never have matched anything that you have said.
Not so
Elegant. But as I was coming up here this time, and I was thinking back to the fact that 2.5 years ago we were together in the freezing cold, and I knew I would see so many people here who were with us 3 years ago and 4 years ago as we bore the burden of that incredible cold, I recognized how extraordinary this fight has become. It's become part of my life, part of our life, it's become your life. And the thing we should celebrate in that fight is how much progress has been made. You know, we're coming up on the 20th anniversary of Granny Dee's walk across the United States. January 1st, 2019 will be the 20th anniversary of the moment she started, and it was 15 months later when she crossed into Waterston.